Hello, and welcome to something a little different. Today I'm gonna give a review on the top-down action stealth game Intravenous. Intravenous was released on July 26, 2021, and very quietly, might I add. Seriously, Intravenous was released under the radar as almost no major website from what I found made mention of it or even acknowledged it back in 2021. Again, at least to my knowledge, that is. Which, honestly is a shame because the creator Roman, sorry if I butcher this, Glebenkov, put in a lot of work for this hidden gem. As his website says, Intravenous is mostly a love letter to the classic Splinter Cell games, which holds up really well, in my opinion. It also greatly reminds me of classic Metal Gear and Hotline Miami combined, like if they had some sort of sick love child. But, enough about that, let's start the review up. We'll jump in headfirst into the story of Intravenous. So, go to, I don't know, we'll put it somewhere on screen this time to skip ahead if you don't want spoilers. Like most games, Intravenous has a storyline that you follow through. Who would have guessed? In Intravenous, you follow the main character, Steve. Not that one. Or that one. There you go, that's the right one, right there. Steve is seen hanging out with his brother Charles. After hanging out for the day, the two head back home where they're interrupted by some low-life thugs. After an altercation, the two of them end up in the hospital where Charles is in a coma and sadly meets his untimely demise. Wanting revenge, Steve tries to get the police involved to take care of these thugs. However, they're unable to assist and help him out. So a month later, wanting to avenge his brother, Steve takes matters into his own hands and becomes a vigilante of sorts to take them out. Kinda think of, like, Batman, but, you know, he kills. So, nothing like Batman. However, it isn't as easy as he thought. Steve breaks in to where Charles died, doesn't find anyone, and doesn't know where to go from there. However, a shady individual simply known as the Accomplice contacts Steve and lends him a hand. He promises to train Steve and give him all the supplies he could ever need to take down the people who wronged him. In return, Steve must also help the Accomplice get some revenge that he wants. With the Accomplice's help, Steve starts to mow through gang member after gang member, eventually getting his revenge on the person responsible for Charles's death. With his brother avenged, Steve now decides he needs to help the Accomplice get some of his own revenge. They follow some more leads until they learn about someone called the Shopkeeper, the one responsible for selling the drugs that are partly to blame for Charles's death, and thus they put an end to him as well. This is a problem though, as the Shopkeeper didn't give Steve and the Accomplice any reliable information to go off of, so Steve uses himself as bait to lure out some more members of the gang to gather some information off of them. From this, they learn of a man called the Baker, the one responsible for making drugs and distributing it to people to sell the drugs, like the Shopkeeper. However, when Steve sets out to kill the Baker, upon meeting him, the Baker makes a deal with Steve. If he lets him live, he'll quit the drug business and disappear forever. This leaves Steve with one of two options: either kill the man responsible for making drugs that helped cause Charles's death, or let him go as enough blood has been shed. Either option, Steve, finally feeling at ease, hangs up his vigilante coat and decides to lay low and rest after putting an end to the drugs related to Charles' death. However, not all is sunshine and rainbows, as while Steve is trying to lay low and relax, some hitmen break into his house, but they prove no match for Steve as he quickly dispatches them and gets intel from one of the survivors before he dies, learning of a man named Empathetic, who is responsible for sending the hitmen. With this information, Steve tries to contact the Accomplice for some help, however he isn't able to. If the Baker is spared, Steve will then contact the Baker and meets up with him. Either way, Steve makes his way towards Empathetic, breaking into his compound and even confronting him. However, it was a trap for Steve. But the two make a deal. Steve lets Empathetic live, he'll help Steve find out who put the bounty on his head. Agreeing to work with Empathetic, Steve is then contacted by the Mole, an undercover cop who promises to tell Steve what he wants to know. In return, Steve must take out another member of the gang operations for the Mole. Once Steve does his part, the Mole tells Steve what he wants to know, and as that a man known as the Accomplice is responsible for wanting Steve dead. Who would have thought? Filled with anger and tired of being used, Steve takes matters into his own hands and sets out to kill the Accomplice for using him so that he can climb his way up the ranks of the drug operation. Breaking into his compound and killing everyone inside, Steve confronts the accomplice. The accomplice begs for his life and begs for Steve not to kill him. However, Steve does not care one bit and ends the accomplice and all of his scheming. Now finally free after avenging Charles and even taking out the man who used him for his own gain, Steve wonders what to do with his life now that he's gone this deep in the rabbit hole. He wonders if he should try to live a normal life, or if he should keep taking these gangs out and prevent another accident from happening. However, only time will tell. While not the most grand story, or the most subtle, as the accomplice's betrayal was pretty obvious, for being made by one man, Intravenous' story fits in really well and gives us, the player, and Steve, a bigger goal and objective as to why Steve is doing the things that he is doing, which works at the end of the day. I mean, seriously, you don't need the grandest of stories for a game as long as it's fun. Speaking of fun, let's see the gameplay now, and see what we'll mostly be doing during this adventure. And now that we know why Steve is doing what he's doing, how does he do it? What's the gameplay like? Well, in Intravenous, you play from a top-down perspective. As Steve, you can do the basics, such as move in all directions, run, crawl, and an interesting mechanic is Steve's movement speed, which is tied to your scroll wheel. If you scroll up, Steve moves at a faster pace, but scroll down and Steve goes for a casual walk. This affects both standing and crawling speeds. Steve is also trained to use firearms. You know, he has to take care of the bad guys somehow. He can spray normally where the reticle points, but if you prefer a more precise shot that can hit more specific objects like lights, you can aim in to increase accuracy at the cost of movement. And if you prefer something besides a gun, Steve can always punch guards or use a variety of tools all at his disposal. Steve can also interact with the environment. He can do simple stuff like opening and closing doors and vaulting over windows and certain walls. He can also pick up trash and use it as a thrown distraction. Steve can also interact with light switches to add some more darkness that pairs well with his night vision goggles, giving you advantage over the enemy. Steve even can open his big mouth and say some friendly words of wisdom, all to get the guard's attention. Or if you want to, you could also hold a button and speak into your computer or headset's microphone and distract the guard that way. Good day, gentlemen. Would you happen to have the time? Now, being a stealth game, Intravenous prefers it if you take the sneakier route, which is why at all times you can see how visible you are with the visibility meter, and how loud you are with the noise meter. Paired with multiple ways to distract or lure guards, stealth is generally the preferred method of play for Intravenous. However, in most stealth games, the player will most likely get caught every now and then. Like I mentioned before, Steve is trained in multiple firearms, which range from handguns, submachine guns, shotguns, assault rifles, and a handy tranquilizing rifle. Besides guns, Steve also has access to a variety of tools, such as explosives like hand grenades, flashbangs, and claymores, or a stun gun for non-lethal protection, or an EMP gun to take out those pesky lights temporarily. Or if you're feeling old-fashioned, you always have access to a throwing knife for silent, long-range takedowns. Whatever method you choose, Steve has many means of dispatching enemies in this beautifully made environment. What's that? Did I say beautifully made? That sounds like a transition to me, and you'd be right. Graphically and visually, Intravenous does a pretty good job at setting the mood with its environments, and surprisingly, a lot of the levels and environments pop out. I personally thought it would have been nothing but abandoned buildings and slums. However, a few missions later, and we're infiltrating mansions, bunkers, and compounds, which all help with immersion at the end of the day. Speaking of immersion, the music really helps in that department. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the entire soundtrack, which was made entirely by the artist Extruller, however you pronounce it. They're known for their original dubstep music and remixes of other songs. And honestly, there couldn't have been a better choice, as every song fits Intravenous perfectly, along with each one of them having two unique distinct phases. Now, I may have said 2 phases, but technically every song in Intravenous has 3 phases: hidden, alerted, and spotted. First, while sneaking around, you're in the hidden phase. The music doesn't play, instead it lets the ambience take over, which just adds on to the suspense of sneaking around, making you think anything can happen at any moment. Then, if anything suspicious happens that alerts the guards, the song moves on to the alerted state, which is slowly building tension. And if Steve is detected and in combat, the spawed state will begin, releasing all the tension, hyping the player up in the intense situation. And if you're looking for my personal favorites, I prefer Conviction, Cloak and Stagger, Assert, and Vengeance. In no real particular order. All in all, I believe that Intravenous is an indie game that was overlooked by the greater majority. Not saying the other indie games don't deserve the love they got, I just honestly believe Intravenous deserves some love and appreciation, especially for being made by a sole developer. As a bonus, it's cheap at only $12.99 USD, and is staying at that price for the foreseeable future. Intravenous is highly worth it if you're a fan of classic Splinter Cell, or Metal Gear, or Hotline Miami. Although its story can be very obvious with its twists, sometimes just having a fun game for the sake of having a fun game is all that really matters at the end of the day. But it's just my opinion. Anyone is free to make their own, so why not try out the game for yourself? And if you find that you liked it, a sequel is currently on its way. Until then, that will be all for today. If you enjoyed, why not throw a like or subscription my way, or even leave a comment down below. No matter what you do, have a good day, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.